Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Kosta Kalpos. He is the head of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Okta. Kosta, good to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And let's talk about agency modernization, legacy technology, always abiding issue with federal agencies. You've looked at this and found that the modernization journey differs somewhat, whether you are a federal civilian agency, defense, or maybe in the intelligence community. What are the differences you're seeing and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, so when I was in government, I integrated inside the federal executive civilian branch. And one of the things that's kind of really imperative to understand inside of all of these different areas is like how they build their infrastructure and how their telecommunication contracts are put into place. So in the DoD and in the IC, you have these universal enterprises that are both, in the DoD you have SIPR, NIPRNet, and all the branches of military connect to these networks. Or in the Fed Civ, you have, one agency has Verizon, one agency has Sprint, one agency has AT&T, and there's 109 independent agencies. And then if you consider if they do dual banding for network resilience, they may have, there's roughly around 250 different internet service provider contracts and infrastructures, and then there's all shared services that are attached to those. So when we think about that scope, we think about the time to modernize. The modernization effort has been all the way back to before the Obama administration. And there's been a natural laggard just because there's been how do you modernize in this larger ecosystem with independent awards in a way that allows scale, right? In a way that allows universal buying across all of these platforms. That's one of the areas that I think that the civilian agencies has been a natural laggard inside government when it comes to tech modernization, just because there's so much contract, so much independent buying happening.
So it becomes something every agency seems to do on its own.
Correct.
Rather than some even department-wide, in that case, for approach. Got it. All right, and of course, the other complicating factor is the fact of a continuing resolution, now a full year one. It's been a few years since we've had an entire full year continuing resolution for, of course, fiscal 25. And that's making agencies' investments kind of hard to initiate new investments and new projects if that's what they had in mind. Where else do you think they can find funding? Where are you telling customers to go to say, hey, you can still do this if you go here?
Unfortunately, it's almost becoming the norm to have a CR at some point, either be a week, a month, and then this year being a full year CR. Discretionary funding is tremendously hard to find, especially when you're at the operator level. When I was an integrator inside government, I didn't have view to budget until I went to OMB and had that, understanding. But there are areas, even codified areas, where agencies have discretionary funding. And it allows them to do some more smart purchasing in the prior year. There's these things called non-reoccurring expense funds, or NEFs. And what they do is they allow surplus funding from the prior fiscal year into the next fiscal year, and it's codified in law that says it's only to be used for information system modernization and business application modernization. So it is a tech-specific NEF. I believe there's 5 agencies that currently have that, and if you look, down to their FISMA rating and their scorecard, you naturally see the working capital fund. I think FATARA scores the ones that have an A all have NEF fundings for their CIO having a working capital fund. So it just allows for smarter buying, and then the general consensus that I get is. From the Hill is, well, they're just going to spend the money. Well, that's not the case. National Science Foundation, for example, up until last year, has returned the full budget, the full surplus back to the Treasury Department every year, which shows that there is responsible use of that working capital fund. There's also other areas. So you have this kind of codified budget that allows for short-term spending for unfunded mandates and that time old tale. You also have things like the Technology Modernization Fund. There's a lot of question on where that funding stands. I know that there's still, the American Rescue Plan put $1 billion into that. Congress rescinded a number of that budget. But there's also a large balance left inside the technology modernization fund that agencies can utilize. And it just allows for their buying power to be, I think at the minimum payback's 50%. So like 50 cents on the dollar. So I would always encourage agencies to have a conversation with their OMB resource management officers, or what they call the RMOs, and talk to them about these discretionary funding avenues to see if that's something that they can entertain with new programs, broadening their zero trust journey, broadening their identity investment.
The challenge in that approach, though, it doesn't get to the issue that you mentioned earlier, which is some kind of a comprehensive approach across multiple agencies.
Right.
But it's better than nothing happening, you might say.
100%.
All right. And do you see agencies actually doing this? I mean, one of the things that contractors can help, such as, I'll make an analogy to the end of the fiscal year, they can help an agency know, well, I know there's a contracting officer here that has a little capacity. You could use him or her to get your thing done, even though your usual 1102 is tied up.
Right.
By the same token, you can say, have you tried this fund or that fund? Often you can actually enlighten an agency as to something that an individual may not know is in there.
Yeah. And there's also it's a great point, because one of the things that OMB likes to provide discretionary funding to is when agencies already have a skin in the game in a program. So not a new program that's multi-year, but something that is 90% of the way there, that just needs to get over the hump with an initial investment. The procurement model inside government needs to change, because the way, I read, I think, a Forbes article that talked about the speed of innovation. 10 years ago, to go to market, it would take roughly 8 years between concept to market on the technology side. Now we're like at a 3-year turnaround. So when an agency releases an RFI and then an RFP, and then it's procured, and then it's bought, and then it's, there might be a protest period, with some scope creep there, and then by the time it's implemented, you're at like a 3-year process. So by the time you're done implementing the new thing, you're buying the next new thing. And that's just because the way that the purchasing is done now is that it's built on these like large monoliths. So I always make the analogy of, the platform that takes a space shuttle to the launch pad. It's very complex, it's very large, takes a long time and it's hard to replicate. That doesn't really work in modular ecosystems anymore. You got to have like the Pinto acquisition, right? You have to have smaller acquisitions to be able to say, I only need to use the golf cart to get to this place, and then I use the Pinto to get there. And then just being able to cycle those things in and out of your ecosystem in a more granular way. I
hadn't thought of Pintos in a long time. I appreciate the drive down memory lane there.
100%.
And switching gears here for a minute, cybersecurity is another investment that is ongoing for federal agencies, and they kind of have to invest in that regardless of what the budgetary situation is. And cybersecurity is increasingly becoming an issue of identity management. I mean, that's kind of the core of cyber approaches. Talk about the unified identity platform, how that's coming into vogue, what that is, and how that helps the investment in cyber.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I think is important to frame prior is, 80% of threats come from the user, and that's just clicks. So the threat vectors that mainly affect information systems come from user clicks or some sort of access to an end user. And then when you start thinking about how the government has, focused its zero trust journey, which is data's one of the pillars, or you have identity as the first pillar. The government focused primarily in the last number of years on the data pillar. M2131 was a mandate to logging and enumeration of environments, which I think is important because you have to have proper asset classification to be able to start providing the identity and access management. So you have to be able to say, like, these are my crown jewels, this is what they are, and this is the sensitivity that it means to my business or to my agency. So when you have the identity side, it's really important that agencies own their identity, that they are the sole provider and the sole owner of their identity. And I think that's something that Okta provides, and I was excited to come to Okta, to be honest, out of government. But I'll also say that inside the identity stack, limiting access to need to know is very important. being able to provide when the government's very transient, when there is someone leaves, for example, to be able to kind of universally log them out from their function, or if there's an incident that occurs, you want to know that if the incident's coming from an end user state, that you can, a global token revocation and a universal log out from that one function to stop what's happening. Because the whole idea of zero trust is you open one door, then you open 10 other doors, and then 10 other doors behind each one of those doors. So I think that's where identity plays a critical role in assisting the government in kind of managing the risk.
So that takes identity beyond your directory services and so forth into a much more comprehensive view of what that entity is. Because people have multiple devices now, and that's part of it also. That a given entity has many vectors in from just a hardware standpoint.
Yeah, and you don't have, I think the common misconception is it's just SSO or single sign-on, that we're only doing multi-factor authentication. There's complementary aspects where, if you have a unified identity platform, you have your identity layer and you have your identity and access management layer that we were talking about prior, that metadata is feeding inside of your logging capabilities. So your Elastic or your Splunk. That also feeds into your SOC operations. So you're allowing, if we think about the workforce gap inside the cyber workforce in industry, and then it's also obviously a natural laggard inside government, how are we able to eliminate the scope creep in the incident responders timeline? So if you have one person that's 100% of capacity and you're able to put an efficient program inside of their system, and you're able to maybe decrease that by 20%, to modernize, and to be able to say, hey, we have access leak here, we can log out universally from there. That is going to allow for a more sustained solution to a current control value and cyber workforce gap.
All right, we'll take a short break on that point. My guest today is Kosta Kalpos. He's the head of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Okta. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin on Federal Insights, sponsored by Okta here on Federal News Network. Welcome back to Federal Insights, sponsored by Okta here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Kosta Kalpos. He is the head of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Okta. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. And as we implied before the break, people have to buy things in order to modernize.
That's right.
And that gets into the topic of the apparent FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation rewrite that is going on. And this could be really a big change for government going about the process of buying the next technology stack. What do you see ahead? Could this help things? Could it make things faster?
It's trying to build as much objective guidance. It's unknown. You just recently had an executive order that came out for the GSA to have consolidated buying. There's been a long time stance inside of the DC area where it comes to leveraging resellers for new innovations, just because there's a burden to comply, which kind of provides a little bit of barrier to entry into the market. So the federal government right now is saying, the FAR has had riders alongside of it for a number of years, but the general intent was to allow for a commercial first approach when available. To not create bespoke government solutions that might be more costly, and then you have hardware refresh, and you have other long-term O&M investments or operation and maintenance investments. So I think this FAR rewrite has been a long-standing appetite to kind of, hey, if we can green grass this, and we were talking about earlier about the kind of how government acquisition is kind of slow. If we can green grass this, what does that look like? And I think that only gets solved with a large public to private conversation, and there'll be comment periods, and all of us in this space will participate and provide our insights. But I do know also that the government is looking to provide value to OEMs. Like, how can we incentivize you to sell directly to us? So that conversation is just beginning. I mean, the EO came out a week ago from this taping. So.
Right, because there are economic and financial reasons for a multi-tiered distribution to exist.
Correct.
Nobody made it up just for the sake of having middlemen, you might say.
Right.
And then the other big change seems to be coming to the FedRAMP long-established initiative. It's been slow and expensive. Now they have FedRAMP 20X initiative.
Right.
What do you expect to come out of that, and how can that help both sides?
So, again, going to the general sentiment, because it came out, I believe, a number of days ago, it's net good for the FedRAMP program. I mean, trying to eliminate the timeline down from years to weeks. I think everyone in the industry would be open to that. Now, for existing ATOs, that is something that hasn't been really defined yet. If there's going to be, companies spend a significant amount to get to a FedRAMP authorization, whether it be moderate or high, with this new kind of automation and continuous monitoring model, are there going to be new requirements for existing ATOs that's going to have to further add to an investment that maybe haven't baked into a fiscal year planning? So that is one that is part of kind of in the conversation right now, like how that's going to look for existing ATOs. For new products coming into the FedRAMP marketplace, I think it's net good. They're going to be leveraging existing industry standards and certifications to be inherited inside of that environment. There's also going to be a removal of the agency sponsor, where there's not going to be that burden that you have to find someone and an agency willing to spend the money and then also do the work alongside of you. I think there will be more of like a federated marketplace for the GSA, and it's needed to just scale. I mean, if we go back to what we were talking about, the time to innovation to market, you need to have that type of model to be able to scale and then leverage the best technologies, leverage the ones that price themselves to be more competitive. That is just going to allow from going from an oligopoly to a little bit more of a perfectly competitive market in software. And they are having a very much a cloud-first approach. And a cloud-first and commercial-first approach in government, and that is something that I think that is going to benefit FedRAMP. And I know just from my conversations with the director, he's very willing to talk to industry, the good, bad, and the ugly, right? I mean, that is something that I would champion on his behalf, that he's done very well.
Right, because that's an important point. There have been mass cancellations, and in some cases, almost mass reinstatements of not only people, but of contracts.
Right.
And you're finding that now there's maybe some light in the clouds where the government and the officials in charge are starting to talk to industry. Maybe it's dawning on them that industry helps in some ways.
Right. I mean, we're going to be very closely aligned with the FedRAMP Program Management Office, just because we have the second most utilized reused ATO in government. So I think we have a lot of use case where we can provide some more, our security team can provide some granular feedback. So we are really tracking this. We standing up a working group internally just to be able to support the vision that Director Waterman has.
All right, and let's talk about special government employees. And they have to face these environments and get work done.
Yeah.
How does that map across the multi-cloud environment and the access challenges that agencies have when you have these SGEs coming in large numbers?
Yeah, access becomes critical when you have a transient environment. You have new people coming in, people moving out. When I was in government and I had left, I actually reached back to the government because I found that I still had access to other systems, and not sensitive systems, but they were still access to where I was. But you knew that
if they knew, they wouldn't want you on there.
Exactly, right. So that is something that's critical just in terms of a cybersecurity hygiene and vulnerability management best practice. It's like you want to be able to manage your access. I know that there's a large conversation about DOJ. Now, going back to the USDS, the United States Digital Service, that was the predecessor to DOJ, that was still a transient office. I mean, that was a way to bring in the best engineers from industry on these like short-term stints to, have your public service and then, cycle back out. So it's a long-standing practice. It's not new. Now, there's a younger generation coming into the government. If we go back to our conversation about the workforce gap, I think the federal government should see that somewhat as a control value. I benefited coming into government when I was young and learning and, having some tools that allowed me to be more efficient in my day-to-day. and then go back to industry and sharpen your knife to be a sharp edge, and then towards the end come back. And then provide that insight to the younger generations that's there, and then you have this pass off. Suzanne Spalding is the one who told me that when I was at DHS, and I remembered that vividly in my brain, and I thank her for that. But there is a need, if you have that control value that we just talked about, for the younger generation to be able to have these enabling tools around them. We're seeing new folks come in through special hiring. We're also seeing, change in the workforce. So how are we enabling someone that comes in day one, and this isn't just government, I think this is every organization, to be the most useful and beneficial to to their mission when they come on board?
And we just have a few seconds left. I wanted to ask you what your sense of how the migration of people from federal to state and local level of government, where they struggle more with cybersecurity and a secure infrastructure, could some of that talent and knowledge at the federal level help cyber at the state and local level, do you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because of, if you think about detail assignments. So detail assignments inside government is, you're at one agency and then you go to another and you get experience and you bring it back. So if you've been in the federal government for a long period of time, you need to be able to, and you're going to a state government, there may be avenues of programs and benefits that aren't available, right? So if you're having this cycle between state and federal, it's just broadening the sharing of information between the two and the knowledge.
And that's always a good thing.
Always a good thing.
Well, thanks so much for your insight. My guest today has been Kosta Kalpos. He is the head of Global Government Affairs and Public Policy at Okta. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Okta.